My wife mocked me for signing a prenup without a lawyer. I said 7 words, and she went pale. Buckhead apartment. Wedding invitations scattered across the coffee table. Kendra placed the thick prenup stack on the table with confident authority. She pressured Julian to sign immediately, treating this like a simple formality. Julian didn't argue aggressively, only requesting to read thoroughly. But when he flipped to the appendix section, one tiny legal phrase made him pause. Beneficial owner, controlling interest. She had no idea who she'd been playing with for 8 months. Julian quickly photographed several pages on his phone. He would sign this prenup, but not the way she thought. Soon enough, Kendra would understand why 7 words from Julian's mouth could make her face go pale. Before we continue to see how Julian handles this situation, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Are you watching from Atlanta, Miami, Jamaica, or maybe Tobago? Let me know in the comments. Now, let the story begin. The Buckhead apartment felt different tonight. Wedding invitations scattered across the mahogany coffee table, their elegant script catching the lamplight. Julian Pierce expected they'd plan their future together. Instead, Kendra Hayes dropped a thick legal document beside the invitations. "Sign this tonight, baby," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Just paperwork. We've been calling each other husband and wife for months anyway." Julian picked up the prenuptial agreement, feeling its professional weight. Kendra settled into the leather armchair, fingers drumming impatiently against the armrest. "I'd like to read through this first," Julian said, flipping to the opening page. Dense legal language filled with asset protection clauses stared back at him. "Maybe we should go over it together." Kendra's laugh was sharp. "Come on, Julian. Standard stuff. Protects what's mine, protects what's yours." Her eyes avoided his when she spoke. Julian's methodical nature kicked in as he photographed each page with his phone. Kendra shifted restlessly, her impatience growing with each careful page turn. "You're overthinking this," she said, moving to the window. "Just a formality, something my family insisted on." The mention of her family made Julian pause. 8 months engaged, and he'd met her mother twice. The first sections covered basic asset separation, nothing unusual. But when Julian reached the appendix, buried in legal terminology, certain phrases jumped out. Beneficial owner, controlling interest, shell company dissolution. These weren't standard prenup terms. These were corporate structure phrases, ones he knew intimately from business dealings. His pulse quickened, but his expression remained neutral. Kendra stood at the window, apparently watching Atlanta's skyline. She had no idea what she'd just handed him. The document wasn't just a prenup. Hidden beneath marital protection language lay something far more complex. References to unfamiliar companies, financial structures designed to consolidate rather than separate assets. "I'll need to schedule a notary appointment," Julian said finally, closing the document. "Want everything done properly." Kendra spun around, composure slipping momentarily. "Why can't we handle it ourselves? It's not complicated." But Julian was already scrolling through notary services. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Tomorrow afternoon work?" After Kendra retreated to the bedroom claiming phone calls, Julian sat alone. The wedding invitations seemed to mock him now, promising a future that felt suddenly uncertain. He reopened the document, business instincts fully engaged. Every clause, every subclause examined for hidden agendas. Kendra's voice drifted from the bedroom. He caught fragments. "Tomorrow, I'll make sure he signs before." The rest was muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. Julian photographed the remaining pages, paying special attention to the appendix. Patterns emerged in the complex language. This wasn't asset protection. This was something else entirely. The bedroom door opened. Kendra emerged with a bright, forced smile. "All set for tomorrow?" Her voice carried artificial lightness. Julian nodded, setting the prenup carefully on the coffee table. "All set." As Kendra gathered wedding invitations, chattering about arrangements and guests, Julian was already strategizing. Tomorrow's notary appointment would be very interesting indeed. The Hayes family home in southwest Atlanta carried the weight of old money and older expectations. Julian pulled into the circular driveway, noting the perfectly manicured lawn and imposing colonial facade. This was his first real dinner with Kendra's extended family, and he sensed tonight would reveal more than Sunday pleasantries. Denise Hayes opened the door before Julian could knock. Kendra's mother stood in the doorway like a sentinel, her silver hair pulled back severely, her gaze assessing him with cool calculation. "Julian," she said, her smile sharp as cut glass. "Finally meeting the man who's been living with my daughter." The way she emphasized living with carried unmistakable disapproval. The dining room buzzed with conversation as relatives filled antique chairs around a massive oak table. Cousin Tanya, Uncle Robert, Aunt Beverly, names Julian struggled to track as introductions flew past. Kendra seemed different here, smaller somehow, constantly glancing toward her mother for approval. The china was expensive, the wine was older than Julian, and every detail screamed family legacy. "So Julian," Denise said as the main course arrived, her voice carrying across the table with practiced authority. "Kendra tells us you'll be signing papers tomorrow. How fortunate that you found someone willing to take care of the legal complexities for you." Murmurs of amusement rippled around the table. Julian felt every eye on him, measuring his response. "I appreciate having time to read everything thoroughly," Julian replied evenly. "It's important both families understand what we're agreeing to." Cousin Tanya laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Oh, honey, it's just standard protection. Nothing for you to worry your head about." The condescension was barely veiled, and Julian recognized the dismissive pattern he'd encountered throughout his career. Denise leaned forward, her smile never wavering. "We're just grateful Kendra found someone so grounded, someone who understands his position in all this." The word position hung in the air like smoke. Uncle Robert nodded sagely. "Smart girl, our Kendra. Always thinking ahead, always planning for security." The family's approval felt rehearsed, like lines from a play Julian hadn't auditioned for. As dinner progressed, Julian listened more than he spoke. Conversations revealed telling details, whispered mentions of property developments, upcoming business ventures, financial restructuring that required clean paperwork. Kendra barely contributed, seemingly content to let her family orchestrate the evening's narrative. "Once everything's signed and settled," Aunt Beverly said, refilling her wine glass, "you'll see how much easier things become. No complications, no confusion about who owns what." Cousin Tanya giggled. "Once it's locked down, there's no going back." Her words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Julian excused himself to the bathroom, noting family photos lining the hallway. Multiple generations of Hayes women, all with the same calculating eyes, the same practiced smiles. When he returned, voices dropped to whispers that ceased entirely upon his approach. Denise was speaking intently to Kendra, their heads bent together in obvious conspiracy. The evening concluded with forced pleasantries and promises to stay in touch. As Julian and Kendra walked to his car, he caught Denise's final words to her daughter. "Tomorrow changes everything. Make sure he signs before he thinks too hard about it." The older woman's voice carried across the evening air with unmistakable finality. During the drive home, Kendra seemed nervous, chattering about wedding details and guest arrangements. But Julian's mind was elsewhere, processing the evening's revelations. The Hayes family hadn't been welcoming him. They'd been positioning him. The underground parking garage of Julian's office building provided the privacy he needed. 11:30 at night, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between concrete pillars. Julian sat in his BMW, the prenup spread across his steering wheel, his phone already dialing a number he hadn't used in months. "Mitchell Thornton speaking." The voice was crisp despite the late hour. Julian's former law school roommate had built a reputation handling complex corporate structures, the kind that required discretion and expertise. "Julian Pierce, I need a favor, and I need it tonight." Mitchell's pause indicated he understood the urgency. "Send me what you've got. I'll call you back in an hour." Julian photographed every page again, this time with professional-grade clarity. The prenup's true nature was becoming clearer with each clause he examined. Shell companies, beneficial ownership transfers, dissolution triggers that would activate under specific conditions. Someone had spent considerable money crafting this document, and it wasn't designed to protect marriage assets. It was designed to acquire them. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Mitchell. "Call me, now." Julian dialed immediately, knowing his friend's tone meant trouble. "This isn't a prenup, Julian. This is a corporate takeover disguised as marital protection. Whoever drafted this knows exactly what they're doing." Mitchell's voice carried professional concern. These dissolution triggers would transfer controlling interest of any company you're involved with directly to your spouse upon marriage. It's sophisticated and completely legal. How sophisticated? Julian asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sophisticated enough that most people wouldn't catch it until too late. The beneficial owner clauses are buried in subsections that reference other subsections. Classic misdirection. Mitchell paused, and Julian heard papers rustling. Julian, if you sign this as written, you're essentially handing over control of everything you own to someone else. The marriage becomes irrelevant. They could divorce you the next day and keep everything. Julian felt pieces clicking into place with mechanical precision. The West Side Development project he had been quietly financing through holding companies. The real estate acquisitions his shell corporations had been making across Atlanta. Properties that would be worth millions once the development went public. Kendra worked in commercial real estate. She would have access to information about upcoming developments, insider knowledge about which properties would increase in value. I need you to prepare something else, Julian said, his voice steady despite the implications. A counter document. Same format, same legal language, but with different beneficial ownership structures. Mitchell's silence stretched long enough that Julian wondered if the call had dropped. Julian, what exactly are you planning? His friend's voice carried warning. Justice? Julian replied simply. Can you have something ready by tomorrow afternoon? The return drive to Buckhead took 20 minutes, but Julian's mind was already days ahead. The notary appointment, the family dinner, the careful positioning, all of it pointed toward a coordinated effort. But coordination required communication, and communication left traces. By the time he reached his apartment, Julian had formulated a plan that would require patience, precision, and perfect timing. Kendra was asleep when he entered, her phone charging on the nightstand. Julian noted the device's position, the way it faced away from the bed. Even unconscious, she maintained operational security. He changed clothes quietly, his movements careful not to disturb her, but his mind cataloging everything with new clarity. Tomorrow would begin the most important negotiation of his life. The prenup sat on his nightstand like a challenge waiting to be answered. Morning light filtered through the Buckhead apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows as Kendra moved around the kitchen with unusual attention to detail. Fresh coffee, Julian's favorite pastries from the bakery downtown, even flowers arranged in the crystal vase she typically reserved for special occasions. Her transformation from last night's tense dinner companion to this morning's attentive fiancé felt orchestrated. I was thinking, she said, sliding a perfectly prepared plate across the marble counter, maybe we're making this prenup thing too complicated. It really is just standard protection, baby. My mom's lawyer says everyone does it this way now. Her smile was radiant, but Julian noticed how her eyes kept darting to his phone, checking for notifications or calls that might complicate her timeline. Julian accepted the coffee, noting its perfect temperature and the way Kendra lingered close enough for her perfume to reach him. Physical proximity as persuasion technique, he'd seen it used in boardrooms countless times. I appreciate you wanting to simplify things, he said carefully, but I'd still feel better having everything properly notarized. It's important to do this right. Kendra's smile flickered briefly before returning full strength. Of course, honey, I just meant we don't need to overthink every little detail. She moved to the window, her voice taking on that casual tone he'd learned meant carefully rehearsed words. Speaking of details, I might need to step out this afternoon. Some last-minute wedding vendor meetings. You know how it is. Julian nodded, sipping his coffee while cataloging this new information. The timing felt convenient, giving her an alibi for whatever conversations she needed to have. His phone buzzed with a text from Mitchell. Package ready for pickup. Julian deleted the message immediately, but not before Kendra noticed his phone activity. Work stuff, she asked, her tone light, but her attention focused. Just confirming today's notary appointment, Julian replied smoothly. 2 o'clock still works? Her relief was almost imperceptible, but he caught it. After Kendra left for her mysterious meetings, Julian sat alone with his breakfast and his thoughts. The apartment felt different now, like a stage set where he'd been playing the wrong character. Every shared moment over 8 months took on new context. Her interest in his business dealings, questions about his investment strategies, casual inquiries about his corporate structures, information gathering disguised as loving curiosity. He opened his laptop and began reviewing financial documents with fresh perspective. The West Side Development Project represented 18 months of careful planning and strategic property acquisition. His shell companies had purchased key parcels across southwest Atlanta, properties that would triple in value once the development went public. Only 3 people knew the full scope of his involvement: himself, Mitchell, and his accountant. Yet somehow the Hayes family seemed remarkably well informed about upcoming opportunities. Julian's phone rang, displaying Kendra's contact photo. He let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message. "Hey baby, just wanted to confirm everything's still on track for this afternoon. I know this whole process feels overwhelming, but once it's done, we can focus on our future together. Love you." The message felt scripted, like she was speaking for an audience beyond just him. He gathered the prenup documents, Mitchell's counter package, and his own carefully prepared materials. The notary appointment would be interesting, but the real game would begin afterward. As Julian prepared to leave the apartment, he noticed Kendra's charging cable still plugged into the kitchen outlet, though her phone was gone. Small details, but in complex negotiations. Small details often revealed larger strategies. The afternoon would determine whether 8 months of his life had been genuine or simply an elaborate business transaction disguised as romance. The notary office in downtown Atlanta occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower, all polished marble and understated elegance. Julian arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying his leather portfolio with practiced confidence. The waiting area featured expensive furniture and legal journals, designed to project competence and discretion. Kendra sat in one of the chairs, her fingers drumming against her purse with barely contained energy. "There you are," she said, standing quickly as he approached. Her smile was bright, but tension radiated from her posture like heat from pavement. "I was starting to worry you'd changed your mind about the timing." Julian kissed her cheek, noting how she seemed to scan the reception area for observers. Everything about her body language suggested performance rather than genuine emotion. The notary, Ms. Patricia Coleman, led them into a private conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She was professional and methodical, spreading documents across the polished table with systematic precision. "We'll need to review each section carefully before witnessing signatures," she explained, adjusting her reading glasses. "Georgia law requires full disclosure of all terms and conditions." Kendra shifted impatiently, checking her watch with obvious anxiety. "Actually," Kendra interjected as Ms. Coleman began reading the opening clauses, "we've already reviewed everything thoroughly. Julian understands all the terms. We can probably skip the detailed walkthrough." Her voice carried forced casualness, but Julian caught the underlying urgency. Ms. Coleman looked up from the documents, her expression professionally neutral but slightly puzzled. "Mrs. Hayes, state law requires comprehensive review regardless of prior familiarity. We need to ensure both parties understand exactly what they're signing." Julian placed his hand gently on the table, drawing attention. "I'd actually prefer to hear every section read aloud. This is too important to rush." Kendra's smile flickered momentarily before returning to full brightness. "Of course, honey. I just thought we could speed things up since we've been over this so many times." But her fingers continued their nervous drumming, and she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting interruption. Ms. Coleman began reading methodically through asset protection clauses, inheritance provisions, and financial responsibility sections. Standard prenup language that Julian had expected. But when she reached the appendix sections, her reading pace slowed noticeably. "These beneficial ownership transfers are quite complex," she observed, looking up at both of them. "Mr. Pierce, do you understand how these clauses would affect any business interests you might hold?" Her question hung in the air with professional weight. "That's exactly what I wanted clarified," Julian said smoothly, pulling out his own portfolio. "I've prepared some additional documentation that might help explain my current corporate structure." Kendra's head snapped toward him, her composure finally cracking slightly. "Additional documentation?" "Julian, we agreed the prenup covered everything we needed." Her voice carried the first hint of genuine alarm he had heard all day. Julian spread his own papers across the table, documents that Mitchell had prepared with surgical precision. Corporate ownership charts, beneficial interest declarations, holding company structures that painted a very different picture than what Kendra had assumed. Ms. Coleman studied the new documents with growing interest, her professional curiosity clearly engaged. "Mr. Pierce, these holdings are quite extensive. The prenup, as written, would significantly impact these corporate relationships. The conference room fell silent except for the distant hum of downtown traffic. Kendra stared at Julian's documents as if they were written in a foreign language, her face pale under the fluorescent lighting. "I think," Julian said quietly, "we need to have a more comprehensive conversation about full disclosure before anyone signs anything." The silence in the notary office stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Kendra stared at Julian's corporate documents spread across the conference table, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally something approaching panic. "Mrs. Coleman continued reviewing the paperwork with professional thoroughness, occasionally making notes that seemed to deepen Kendra's distress. "I think we need to postpone this," Kendra said suddenly, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Julian, clearly there are things we need to discuss privately before involving legal witnesses." She began gathering her copy of the prenup with movements that bordered on frantic. Ms. Coleman looked up from the documents, her expression diplomatically neutral, but clearly sensing the tension shift in the room. Julian remained seated, his posture relaxed despite the charged atmosphere. "Actually, I think we should continue. Full transparency is exactly what we need right now." He gestured toward his corporate holdings documentation. "Kendra, you said the prenup was about protecting what's yours and protecting what's mine. Well, this is what's mine. Shouldn't you know exactly what you're marrying into?" His tone was reasonable, almost gentle, which seemed to unnerve her more than anger would have. "This isn't the time or place for business discussions," Kendra replied, her composure cracking further. "We can handle private matters privately." But Ms. Coleman was already deep in the corporate documentation, cross-referencing it with the prenup clauses. Her professional interest had clearly been sparked by the complexity of what she was reviewing. "Mrs. Hayes, these documents directly impact the agreement you're asking me to notarize." "Mr. Pierce is correct that full disclosure is not only appropriate, but legally advisable." Kendra's phone buzzed insistently. She glanced at it, and Julian caught a flash of her mother's contact photo before she silenced the device. "My family is expecting updates," she said, her explanation sounding hollow even to herself. "They've been planning it around this timeline." The admission revealed more than she'd likely intended, confirming Julian's suspicions about coordinated family involvement in the prenup strategy. "Perhaps your family should join our next conversation," Julian suggested mildly, "since they seem so invested in the outcome." Kendra's face went pale at the suggestion, her carefully maintained facade finally crumbling completely. "That won't be necessary," she said quickly. "This is between us." But her phone continued buzzing with incoming messages, creating an audible countdown to whatever deadline the Hayes family had established. Ms. Coleman cleared her throat diplomatically. "Given the complexity of these holdings and the questions they raise about the original agreement, I'd recommend both parties consult with independent legal counsel before proceeding." Her professional opinion carried weight that neither Julian nor Kendra could easily dismiss. This level of financial complexity requires more thorough review than a standard notary appointment can provide. Julian nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the suggestion for the first time. "You're absolutely right. Kendra, maybe we should take a step back. Make sure we both understand exactly what we're agreeing to." His reasonableness seemed to frustrate her more than confrontation would have. She clearly had expected a different kind of reaction, a different kind of conversation. The drive back to Buckhead passed in tense silence. Kendra stared out the passenger window, her phone silent now, but her anxiety palpable. When they reached the apartment, she turned to him with desperation finally showing through her composure. "Julian, I need you to understand something. My family has certain expectations, certain plans that depend on us moving forward together." Her honesty felt like a last resort rather than genuine communication. "I understand perfectly," Julian replied, his voice carrying new authority that made her look at him with fresh recognition of who she was really dealing with. The Atlanta Marriott Marquis Ballroom buzzed with the energy of serious money and serious deals. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables filled with Atlanta's commercial real estate elite, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum of opportunity and ambition. Kendra moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her earlier anxiety replaced by the confident smile she wore to industry events. This was her element, her network, her chance to finally secure the deal that would establish her career. Julian watched from across the room as she worked the crowd, noting how naturally she shifted between personas depending on her audience. With older male developers, she was deferential and charming. With female executives, she projected competent professionalism. With potential investors, she radiated quiet confidence about insider knowledge. It was masterful performance art, and Julian found himself genuinely impressed despite everything he now knew about her motivations. The Westside Development presentation commanded attention from everyone in the ballroom. Multi-million-dollar investment opportunity, prime Atlanta real estate, projected returns that would make early investors very wealthy. Kendra stood near the front, positioned perfectly to network with key players after the presentation concluded. Her family's months of planning had led to this moment, this convergence of opportunity and positioning. Ladies and gentlemen, the presenter announced, we're pleased to announce our partnership with Hayes Commercial Properties for project management and community liaison services. Applause filled the ballroom as Kendra stepped forward, accepting congratulations from colleagues and potential partners. Her smile was radiant, triumphant, the expression of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally bearing fruit. Julian remained at his table, observing the dynamics with professional detachment. Conversations around him revealed the scope of tonight's networking. Property acquisitions, development timelines, investment structures that would reshape Southwest Atlanta over the next 5 years. Information that would have been incredibly valuable to someone with advanced knowledge of which parcels would become most desirable. When the formal presentations concluded, the crowd transitioned into smaller networking groups. Julian rose from his seat and began moving through the ballroom, not toward Kendra, but toward the cluster of executives surrounding the Westside Development team. His approach was casual, professional, the kind of confident movement that suggested he belonged in these circles naturally. Impressive project, he said to the lead developer, extending his hand in introduction. Julian Pierce. I've been following the development plans with great interest. The developer's handshake was firm, his attention focused as Julian continued. Particularly interested in the land acquisition strategy, very sophisticated approach to assembling the necessary parcels. His words carried just enough specificity to suggest insider knowledge. Across the room, Kendra was engaged in animated conversation with potential investors, her gestures enthusiastic as she outlined projected returns and community benefits. She hadn't noticed Julian's movement through the crowd, hadn't seen him position himself among the key decision makers. Her focus remained on executing the networking strategy that would secure her family's financial future. The conversation around Julian grew more detailed as developers shared insights about property valuations, acquisition challenges, and the complex corporate structures needed for projects of this scale. Julian listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of commercial real estate development. When someone mentioned beneficial ownership requirements for partnership considerations, Julian's expression remained perfectly neutral. Actually, Julian said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw closer attention from the group, I think there might be some interesting ownership questions worth discussing about this particular development. The Westside Development team gathered around Julian with growing interest, their conversation drawing attention from nearby networking groups. Kendra, still engaged with potential investors across the ballroom, remained unaware of the shift in dynamics. The lead developer, Marcus Williams, leaned closer as Julian's questions became more pointed and specific. You mentioned beneficial ownership structures, Williams said, his voice carrying professional curiosity. Are you representing investors in this project? Julian smiled, the expression calm but carrying new authority that made the surrounding executives pay closer attention. In a manner of speaking, yes, I have significant interest in how this development moves forward. His words were carefully chosen, each one landing with deliberate weight. The conversation attracted more participants as Julian demonstrated intimate knowledge of the property acquisition timeline, zoning challenges, and financial structures underlying the Westside project. His questions weren't those of a casual observer, but of someone with deep understanding of commercial real estate development. When he mentioned specific parcels by address and acquisition date, Williams's expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention. Mr. Pierce, Williams said, his tone becoming more formal, exactly what is your involvement with this project? The question carried enough authority to quiet surrounding conversations, creating a pocket of focused attention in the busy ballroom. Julian glanced across the room toward Kendra, who was still networking enthusiastically, unaware that the foundation of her evening was shifting beneath her feet. That's an excellent question, Julian replied, his voice carrying to the growing circle of executives and investors who had gravitated toward their conversation. Perhaps we should clarify ownership structures before anyone makes commitments they might regret. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, the same one he'd carried to the notary appointment. The documents inside would answer Williams's question definitively. Kendra finally noticed the gathering crowd around Julian, her networking smile faltering as she recognized something significant was happening. She began moving toward them, her professional composure intact, but her eyes showing the first hints of concern. The investors she'd been courting followed, drawn by the obvious importance of whatever discussion was commanding so much attention from industry leaders. Julian spread corporate ownership documents across a nearby cocktail table, the same papers that had stunned Ms. Coleman at the notary office. Property deeds, beneficial ownership declarations, holding company structures that painted a comprehensive picture of the Westside Development's true foundation. Williams studied the documents with growing amazement, his professional poker face cracking as the implications became clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the immediate area, "I think we need to clarify something important about tonight's partnership announcements." The ballroom's energy shifted as more people turned toward their group, sensing that whatever was unfolding would impact the evening's business discussions significantly. Kendra reached the edge of the crowd, her face pale as she saw Julian's documents spread before the city's real estate leadership. "Julian," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "what are you doing?" Her question carried across the suddenly quiet space, drawing even more attention to the unfolding revelation. Julian looked directly at her, his expression calm but his words carrying unmistakable finality. "I own your company. I'm the real CEO." The 7 words fell into silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the gathered executives. Kendra's face went completely white, her composure finally shattering as the full weight of his statement registered with devastating clarity. The silence in the Marriott ballroom stretched beyond comfortable into something approaching shock. Julian's 7 words hung in the air like a verdict, transforming the evening's networking energy into stunned recognition. Marcus Williams held Julian's corporate documents, his eyes moving between the ownership papers and Kendra's ashen face with professional amazement. "These holdings are extensive," Williams said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet with deliberate precision. "Mr. Pierce, according to these documents, your shell companies control 67% of the parcels essential to the Westside development." He looked up from the papers, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching respect. "You've been assembling this portfolio for over 18 months. Kendra stood frozen at the edge of the gathered executives, her networking smile completely abandoned. Her hands trembled slightly as the full scope of Julian's revelation settled over the crowd. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. The evidence spread across the cocktail table told a story that required no interpretation or explanation. "Mrs. Hayes," Williams continued, his tone becoming more formal as he addressed Kendra directly, "your partnership proposal was based on community liaison services and project management. But if Mr. Pierce controls the majority of essential properties, that changes the fundamental structure of tonight's discussions." His words carried weight that everyone in the gathered crowd understood implicitly. Julian remained calm as conversations erupted around them, executives processing the implications with rapid-fire professional calculations. Investment timelines, partnership agreements, financial commitments that had seemed certain minutes earlier now required complete reconsideration. Kendra's position as key liaison had evaporated the moment Julian's ownership structure became public knowledge. "Julian," Kendra said, her voice stronger now, but carrying a desperation she couldn't quite hide, "we need to talk privately. This isn't the place for family business." Her attempt to reframe the situation as personal rather than professional fell flat among the crowd of industry professionals who understood exactly what they were witnessing. "Actually," Julian replied, his voice carrying new authority that commanded attention, "this is exactly the place for business discussions. These people deserve to understand the real ownership structure before making investment decisions." He gestured toward the documents William still held. "Full transparency benefits everyone, except those who profit from keeping others in the dark. The crowd began fragmenting into smaller discussion groups, executives pulling out phones to make calls and send messages. Word of the evening's revelation would spread through Atlanta's commercial real estate community within hours. Kendra watched her carefully constructed networking event transform into something entirely beyond her control or influence. The Hayes family partnership proposal, Williams announced to the remaining crowd, will need comprehensive review in light of tonight's ownership disclosures. His professional diplomatic language couldn't mask the reality that Kendra's deal had just disintegrated publicly. Mr. Pierce, I believe we should schedule a more detailed conversation about development timeline and partnership structures. Kendra's phone buzzed insistently with incoming calls, undoubtedly from family members who had been monitoring the evening's progress. She stared at the device as if it contained bad news she wasn't ready to receive. Her triumphant evening had become a professional disaster in the span of 7 carefully chosen words. Julian began gathering his documents, his movements unhurried despite the chaos surrounding them. Kendra, he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, I think it's time we had that comprehensive conversation about full disclosure you've been avoiding. The private conference room at the Marriott provided a stark contrast to the ballroom's earlier energy. Julian sat across from Kendra at a polished table, the same corporate documents that had destroyed her evening spread between them like evidence in a trial. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from family members, each ring seeming to deepen her growing desperation. How long have you known? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The confident woman who had worked the ballroom crowd had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely lost. About the prenup, about my family's plans, about everything. Her hands rested flat on the table, fingers spread as if she were trying to anchor herself to something solid. Julian studied her face, noting the genuine confusion mixed with her obvious distress. I suspected something at the family dinner. Your mother's comments about my position were too calculated to be casual. He gestured toward the documents. But I didn't understand the full scope until my lawyer explained what your prenup actually accomplished. Corporate takeover disguised as marriage protection. Julian, you have to understand, Kendra said, her composure cracking further with each word. My mother arranged everything. The meetings, the lawyers, the timeline. She said it was just standard protection, that every wealthy family handles marriage this way. Her explanation sounded hollow even to herself, and Julian's expression remained skeptically neutral throughout her attempted justification. So you didn't know about my West Side holdings when you started dating me? Julian asked, his tone carrying professional skepticism rather than personal hurt. Your work in commercial real estate, your access to development information, your family's sudden interest in marriage protection, all of that was coincidental? His questions were methodical, each one highlighting another layer of coordination that seemed impossible to dismiss as accident. Kendra's silence stretched long enough to provide its own answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of admission. My mother researches everyone I date seriously. She found out about your shell companies, your property acquisitions, your development investments. She said you were exactly the kind of opportunity our family needed. The confession seemed to exhaust her, leaving her slumped in her chair. An opportunity, Julian repeated, his voice flat with understanding. Not a person, not a partner, a business opportunity that happened to require marriage to access. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at Atlanta's skyline while processing the confirmation of what he'd suspected. How long were you supposed to wait after signing the prenup before filing for divorce? 6 months, Kendra whispered, the admission seeming to surprise her with its honesty. Long enough to establish legal precedent, short enough to minimize complications. My mother had already consulted with divorce attorneys about the cleanest separation strategy once the ownership transfers were complete. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she turned it face down on the table with obvious reluctance to answer. Julian returned to his seat, his expression showing more disappointment than anger. 8 months of my life, he said quietly. 8 months of thinking we were building something real together. Planning a future, making compromises, believing that someone genuinely cared about me rather than what I owned. His words carried hurt that went beyond professional betrayal into something more personal and profound. Julian, Kendra said, reaching across the table as if to touch his hand. Some of it was real. My feelings, our connection, the way we worked together. That wasn't all pretense. But her words lacked conviction, and Julian's withdrawal from her gesture spoke louder than any verbal response he might have offered. 3 days after the Marriott revelation, the consequences rippled through Atlanta's commercial real estate community with devastating precision. Kendra sat in her Hayes Commercial Properties office, staring at termination letters from clients who had suddenly lost confidence in her firm's capabilities. The Westside Development Partnership had been officially suspended pending ownership clarification, effectively ending the deal that was supposed to establish her career. Her phone had stopped ringing entirely, which somehow felt worse than the constant family crisis calls, dolls, of the previous days. Industry contacts who had seemed eager to work with her just weeks earlier now avoided her calls completely. Word traveled fast in Atlanta's tight-knit development community, and being publicly exposed as uninformed about a major project's ownership structure had destroyed her professional credibility. Denise Hayes sat across from her daughter's desk, her usual composed authority replaced by barely controlled fury. "You were supposed to manage him," she said, her voice sharp with accusation. 8 months of careful planning, and you couldn't keep one man under control long enough to sign a simple document. Her disappointment cut deeper than professional failure, carrying the weight of family expectations that had been building for generations. "Mother, he played us," Kendra replied, her own composure finally cracking under the accumulated pressure. "Julian knew exactly what we were doing from the beginning. He let us think we were manipulating him while he gathered evidence and prepared his own strategy." The admission felt like accepting defeat, but denial had become impossible after the ballroom revelation. "The Hayes family doesn't get played," Denise snapped, standing and pacing behind Kendra's chair. "We've been building wealth and influence in this city for 40 years. We don't lose to some upstart who got lucky with property investments." But her anger couldn't change the reality that their carefully constructed plan had collapsed completely and publicly. Kendra's assistant knocked on the office door, interrupting the family crisis meeting with obvious reluctance. "Ms. Hayes, there are reporters here asking about the Westside development situation. They want statements about the ownership disclosures and partnership changes." The news that media attention had found them seemed to drain the last of Denise's combative energy. "No statements," Kendra said firmly, recognizing that any public comment would only extend the damage to her remaining professional relationships. "Tell them we're focusing on serving our existing clients." But they both knew her client base had shrunk dramatically over the past 72 hours, leaving Hayes Commercial Properties essentially inactive. That evening, Kendra found herself driving through Atlanta's streets aimlessly, avoiding both her apartment and her family home. The wedding invitations that had seemed so promising just days earlier now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. 200 guests expecting to celebrate a union that had been revealed as elaborate business fraud disguised as romance. When she finally worked up the courage to call Julian, his number went straight to voicemail. The message she left felt inadequate and desperate. "Julian, I know I have no right to ask, but could we meet one more time? There are things I need to say, things you deserve to hear." She ended the call knowing that her 8 months with him had been the most genuine relationship she'd ever experienced, even though it had been built on her family's deception. The Hayes family's reputation in Atlanta would recover eventually, but Kendra understood that her own career and credibility were probably irreparable. She would have to start over completely, without family connections or industry relationships to cushion the rebuilding process. The neutral coffee shop in Midtown Atlanta provided the kind of anonymous setting that major life conversations sometimes required. Julian arrived first, choosing a corner table away from the afternoon crowd. When Kendra walked through the door 15 minutes later, she looked smaller somehow, her usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility that he'd never seen before. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, settling into the chair across from him. Her voice carried genuine gratitude mixed with obvious nervousness. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after everything that's happened." Julian studied her face, noting the absence of makeup and styled hair that had been constants during their 8 months together. This version of Kendra seemed more authentic than any he had encountered. "I needed to hear it directly from you," Julian said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "The real story, not the version your family constructed or the explanation you gave yourself to make it acceptable." He placed his coffee cup carefully on the table between them, creating a small barrier that felt necessary for the conversation ahead. Kendra took a deep breath before responding, her hands wrapped around her own cup as if seeking warmth. My mother identified you as a target 18 months before we ever met. She researched your investments, your property holdings, your business strategies. When she discovered your West Side involvement, she arranged for us to be introduced at that charity gala. Her confession carried the weight of complete honesty, finally stripping away months of careful deception. So our entire relationship was orchestrated, Julian said, his words carrying more sadness than anger. The places we went, the conversations we had, the plans we made together, all of it was designed to get me to sign documents that would transfer my wealth to your family. The reality felt surreal even as he spoke it, reducing 8 months of his life to an elaborate business transaction. Not all of it, Kendra said quickly, then stopped herself. I mean, yes, initially everything was planned, but Julian, somewhere along the way, my feelings became real. The way you treated me, your intelligence, your kindness, I started caring about you genuinely, even while knowing what my family expected me to accomplish. Her words carried conviction, but Julian's expression remained skeptically neutral. Julian reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between them. The wedding is canceled. All vendors have been notified, all deposits forfeited. The engagement ring is inside. His businesslike approach to ending their relationship felt appropriate given how it had begun. I'm also filing legal documentation to prevent any future claims against my assets based on our previous relationship. I understand, Kendra said, her voice barely audible. Julian, I know I have no right to ask this, but could you ever forgive me? Not for a relationship, not for another chance, just for your own peace of mind? Her question carried desperate hope that he might offer some form of absolution for the months of deception. Julian stood slowly, his decision clearly final. I don't forgive you for the lies, Kendra, but I don't hate you either. I just choose self-respect over revenge. He paused at her chair, his voice gentle but firm. I hope you find a way to build something real for yourself, something that doesn't require deceiving other people. As he walked away, Kendra remained seated, staring at the envelope containing the engagement ring and the end of the only relationship that had ever made her question her family's values. For the first time in her 32 years, she would have to discover who she was without the Hayes family strategy guiding her choices. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying those who wronged you, but walking away with your dignity intact. True strength lies in choosing truth over deception, self-respect over revenge. What would you do if someone you loved had been playing you all along? Hit that like button if Julian made the right choice, and I'll see you in the next story where karma strikes again. Until then, stay strong.